Okay, well, it's just after 6 o'clock now, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started to be respectful of everybody's time. And I also know Mary Jane's got a lot of great insights to share with us, and I want to be sure there's time for questions at the end. So again, my name is Jocelyn. I'm the Executive Director of the Latah County Historical Society, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this presentation, Indigenous Women Influences on Power, Politics, and Place with Mary Jane Oatman. This presentation, besides being presented by the Latah County Historical Society, was made financially possible by the Giving Circle, the Moscow Women's Giving Circle. It's a really fabulous organization. So if you're interested in collaborative philanthropy, I encourage you to find out more about that group. And we are offering this program in conjunction with the viewing of an exhibit called For All the World to See, Visual Culture and the Struggle for Civil Rights. It is a traveling exhibition offered from NEH on the road, National Endowment for the Humanities. I apologize, you can hear my dogs barking in the background. This is the challenge with the era we're living in. So For All the World to See is a really great exhibit about the kind of the traditional civil rights movement that you might think of from the 1940s through the 1970s. And it is really about how photography and television and movies and music and pop culture interacted with and informed the civil rights movement. It's on display at the University of Idaho Library right now. It is there through the end of this year, but I think we'll also, the exhibition, we had it for 7 weeks beginning in November, but I believe it's going to be extended, but I don't have confirmation on that yet. So I encourage you, if you want to see it, to visit the library before December 24th, which is when they're going to close for their holiday break. All you have to do is make an appointment with Library Special Collections, and they can let you in because the library is closed to just in and out traffic. You can also make plans to visit on Mondays or Thursdays at the hours listed on your screen. And while you're there, there's just a little note outside that'll give you a phone number, and you can call the phone number and somebody will pop out and let you in. But really, any hours that the library is open, you are welcome to schedule an appointment to go visit it. We're sad that the exhibit is here during a restricted access period, but it is such a timely topic, civil rights and voting rights, that we thought it was really important that we brought it to town no matter what, because it would be another several years before we were able to get back on the schedule to host it. So as I said, we are offering this program with Mary Jane this evening in conjunction with this. And it's also a way for us to bridge kind of our year-long commemoration of the 19th Amendment Centennial. And we recognize that when the 19th Amendment was passed in 1919 and ultimately ratified in 1920, that not all women in the United States were still able to vote. And one of those groups that still had limited access to the polls were Indigenous women. And I know Mary Jane will be able to provide additional details for that. So I do want to now welcome Mary Jane. I've got a little bio to share here. So Mary Jane Oatman is a mitochondrial matriarch of the Nimiipuu people who inherited the responsibility of recuperating sacred sites in the Nez Perce Treaty territory, while also seeking to restore traditional forms of economy and governance. Born into the Nez Perce Treaty by blood, Oatman is a seventh generation direct descendant of the noted signatory. I am not attempting to pronounce the name, but I will let Mary Jane tell us the Nimiipuu name for Chief Looking Glass. And she advocates for a return to ancestral knowledge systems that strengthen identity, language, and kinship. Mary Jane is the proud mother of 3 beautiful young people and is the founder of Indigenous Cannabis Coalition and publisher of THC Magazine, the nation's first publication dedicated to tribal hemp and cannabis culture. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and invite Mary Jane to share her screen and unmute herself and get us started.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to share briefly the cover of THC Magazine, the very first cover here. to give you a little bit of a visual as I get my screen up here and ready for you. I am super excited to have been invited to be with you all this evening. Oh, so just with me for a quick second while I get my screen. Can you all see my screen now? All right. Okay. Himakas katsiaya nunam hanuat. Hiamsa kinawatis pa oikalo nunam hanuat. Lautiwama ka himyuma. Thank you to our creator for gathering us all here this evening. Inamwat Nikwas, Mary Jane Oatman. Thank you to the Latah County women's group for inviting me this evening, and thank you to Dulcie and to everybody that is participating here. It is winter time. It is definitely our season for sharing story traditionally in our Nez Perce homelands, and so it is an honor to gather as women with our women medicine to share story. I'm going to begin by giving a little bit of my background so that you all can see where I come from. I am mentioned by Dulcie in my bio, mitochondrial matriarch of the Nez Perce Nation. I'm the granddaughter of Alice Johnson Warden and the late John Warden, and the late Marcus Annette Jackson Oatman. Alice was the granddaughter of Tom Hill, noted in many of the Nez Perce war battle historical transcripts, as well as in his mixed lineage as a Delaware descendant as well, who made his way over to the Nez Perce homelands after fleeing the atrocities that were occurring to Delaware people on the East Coast. I'm also proud to share Marcus. Grandfather Marcus Tukalixima was the great-grandson of Chief Looking Glass. It was through my amazing journey at the Lewis Clark State College, where I got a minor in Nez Perce language, that I was placed with my late grandfather Marcus to learn how to speak our language, and endeavored on an amazing project that essentially changed my entire world. And that was through the study of Nez Perce language with a friend and now colleague, Dr. Harold Crook. He has been very pivotal in the preservation of Nez Perce language for our people. And when I first started taking the language with Harold, we had a little bit of a headbutting contest because I was struggling with how to read and write Nez Perce. And that's primarily what we were being tested on. And Harold and I found some middle ground where we eventually started to have oral examinations with the circle of elders by the time that I entered into the third year. But during the second year of Nez Perce language, Harold provided me a gift that opened up the door to an amazing part of myself as a mother that I did not and had not taken the time to slow down and truly understand. And that was a family tree project. Harold said to all of the second year Nez Perce students that he wanted to go through our family tree, through and mine as many resources that we could find out there, and try to provide as many graphics and as many Nez Perce names as possible. And I had never, in my K-12 experience, ever had the academic freedom and intellectual pursuits to study who I was and where I came from. And so I mentioned that as a gift because Harold really pushed me to not just take in first or second year as first language classes, but really encouraged me to pursue minor in Nez Perce language. And I can tell you that that opportunity opened the doors for many. I went on to graduate from Lewis Clark State College and attend the University of Idaho to pursue a master's in anthropology. 21 credits into my master's in anthropology, I was called to serve and appointed as the coordinator of Indian education for the state of Idaho. That opened up a lot of opportunity as well because we had made some great headway in the Idaho State Legislature for preservation of Indigenous language certification and several other critical legislative moves in the state of Idaho. I was called up by the Obama administration to serve as an appointee to the National Advisory Council on Indian Education. From there, I went on and returned back home to my own tribal community and had my daughter completed a national honor to participate in the Native Americans in Philanthropy. It was an amazing opportunity to network and develop a cohort of 2 years with other Indigenous philanthropists and young people working in opening up the doors because the data from the Bush administration at the time is showing that less than 1% of philanthropic dollars was actually going back into Indian country. And so it was giving us the tools and the knowledge about how we could train others within Indian country to build their nonprofit governance and marketing strategies to really go for the ask. And then in 2017, after working with my own tribe to pass critical legislation on pro-cannabis legislation, I was elected to the Minority Cannabis Business Association. 2019, I founded the Indigenous Cannabis Coalition here in Idaho, because after working and serving on the MCBA Board of Directors, it was quite clear that tribal sovereignty was lacking protection in all aspects of legalization of cannabis. And with that, I also realized that there was a lot more education and advocacy that needed to occur for plant-based medicines, as well as a voice piece for how we were finding healing in some of our traditional and pre-European economies that did exist in hemp and cannabis. And so I launched a THC magazine, which is Tribal Hemp and Cannabis, in 2020. And so that's what I have been doing, is working on education and advocacy. THC magazine is the nation's first and only publication dedicated exclusively to tribes in this space. In 2021, we will be launching a podcast, THC Smoke Signals, to provide a digital media platform to tell these stories, because our 10,000 print copies, which are archived in the Library of Congress, are absolutely phenomenal. But we know that to be able to have the reach and meet the needs of the various learning styles, we need to find a better space in the digital media reading place. And so with that, I will get started with what we all came to discuss, and that is the Indigenous women's influence on the suffrage movement. And very humbly and very respectfully let you know, it is just my perspective, just one Nimiipuu Ayat's perspective, based on the reading, the research, and the conversations that I have with other Indigenous women and women supporting this role and movement of reclaiming the power that women have always had in our Indigenous women society. So we will discuss the traditional roles and the impact that these matriarchal cultures have had on the development of our nation, and highlight several of the warrior women who have elevated the role of our women's voice and right in the midst of a developing new world. So it was really interesting as I was looking through the history, some of the early history of women's voices were really elevated, and where more of the Indigenous women's perspective were highlighted. And one thing that I found really critical to note was the timeline. I found that it was really interesting that when it came to the elevation of the Indigenous women's voice, even that alone is lacking a critical perspective from 1492 up until the early 1800s, when this movement to elevate women's voice and women's rights in the New World, it kind of has a big gap there. And so I was really excited to see that there was a lot of prominent figures that did rise to the occasion. And one of those included Matilda Jocelyn Sage. She was an American suffragist and abolitionist. And I was really intrigued by how she was able to eloquently compare and contrast the distinctions from old world customs to new world customs. And I think that many of us as mothers now can sometimes have a hard time understanding this time period because of how far we have come as a society, thanks to women like Matilda and Elizabeth Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who all did their fair share of work. But what is really interesting to note was how Gage, having grown up on the homelands of the Haudenosaunee, had really a critical perspective through that upbringing of those homelands to really include the rights of Indigenous women and the matriarchal society, which she had the influence of being able to see. She writes it she notes in her writing how the economic distinction of independence that the women had at the time, from being able to own their own property, being able to have rights over their children. And I just think that it is really, really telling that these women were digging in very deep to the nuances of what they had experienced in the Indigenous matriarchal societies, to elevate the platform in a very contentious time frame that they were doing it in. So the influences of the matriarchal society include those shared leadership responsibilities. One of those shared leadership responsibilities, at that time was even just in the appointment for the Iroquois people at that time, the appointment of the chief system, and that the women actually, the chief clan mother had the responsibility of choosing this chief, advising and holding them into office. And I imagine that during that time frame, there were, while it is documented, and I've had the opportunity to read a lot of the and a good source also is the British literature and some of the early journals from that time frame, is I guess you could say the conundrum that they faced in the conversion of the Indigenous people to Christianity, even during that time frame. And it was largely noted it was because of the intense and very deeply rooted culture of the matriarchal societies. And so European women of Gage's time that were living under the conditions that they were, absolutely in direct contrast, including the British Blackstone Code that read, "By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband. under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything. And so in that same time period, and earlier on, there was some amazing influences as we're looking at the Louisiana Purchase time frame and everything that happened from then on. We, I guess we could note that even during that time frame, we still had not come as far as we have now, that women's subjugation and rights had still not making the leaps and bounds that they well deserved. And a lot of that is evident in the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery. So the women's voice on the expedition, while Sacagawea fills the many pages and has prominent passages of and journeys that she did as part of this journey, I think that there's still a lot that's lacking with the, I got this blocked on my screen. A lot to be desired for elevating her true role, as well as the role of that of Watkuis. Watkuis was one of the earlier people in Nez Perce history that I had heard of as a young Nez Perce woman, and it wasn't until college. Again, it goes back to that when I was in the K-12 high school curriculum, you just don't have that educational freedom and intellectual freedom to have those types of pursuits. So when I did attend Lewis Clark State College, I dove into as much Nimiipuu curriculum and Nez Perce history that I could find out there. And Watkuis was the earliest and most prominent Nez Perce female figure that you would hear come up quite a bit. But it wasn't until last year when I started doing a little bit more research on the commemoration of the 100 years, and it was really when I started to think a little bit more critically about Watkuis's role in the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery, because while she wasn't written about directly in her role of saving Lewis and Clark, because they were not aware, they wrote about her and what she had experienced. And the Watkuis, or return from a far land, because the Nez Perce retell and recount the act of her telling the Nez Perce warriors to do them no hurt, really elevated to me as a Nez Perce woman how much voice and say that a woman had, even in a time of war, which was for me important, because as I was finding myself learning Nez Perce language and trying to go further back into distinction between the roles and responsibilities of our Nez Perce people, contemporary as well as prehistoric. And I'd always heard from my grandparents, my grandfathers, Nez Perce women, you don't hunt. Our role is to take care of the meat. Yet today, we have many Nez Perce women that go out and hunt. And so trying to find the balance between our new roles and our old roles. And part of that for me was realizing that I had to kind of cleanse myself of some of the perspectives that I was even looking at this through. Because when I think about the Nez Perce woman, Watkuis, being able to stand up and say, do them no hurt, and that they heeded her message and her warning was very powerful. Because when we fast forwarded to everything post 1855 with the Nez Perce, our women women's voice is lost. It's very rarely captured. An example of that is in Chief Yellow Wolf's book. He talks quite a bit about my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Chief Looking Glass, a Paswaheg. There's another passage within that book where he talks about Chief Looking Glass's daughter at the Battle of Big Hole, running through the fire, the open gunfire, to a cache of rifles and retrieving the rifles and bringing them back to the Nez Perce warriors so that they were able to retreat from the Battle of Big Hole. And it wasn't until I was in that Nez Perce language class and having the pursuit of the Family Tree Project that I had been empowered enough to know that that woman that they were talking about was Pi'enhoch'towit, Chief Looking Glass's daughter. Her name, her Christian given name when she returned from Canada, where she had escaped with the Yellow Wolf Band, returned was given the name Mary Oatman. And that's the name that I carry now, or what I was passed down on to me. And so the role that our Nez Perce women play, and play to this day, I do believe still is lacking in its documentation, and is another big part of why I believe in the preservation of story and the elevation of our women's roles in the recollections of even the Lewis and Clark journals, to be able to mine through some of that data to find the robust women's economies that were threaded throughout the census that was taking, because I see that that's what was definitely occurring as the Corps of Discovery came through here with their journals, is there's so many nuances and treasures that are within those passages about women's roles throughout Turtle Island, from each band or village, where they discuss how strong and robust those matriarchal societies were, or how that without the women, that those societies and communities would not survive, thrive, or exist. And so it's really exciting to tear apart some of the history that does exist and mine it for those treasures of women's voices. Another one that I came across that was super exciting to read more about, because I have so many friends that are Lakota from those homelands, was Kalasaw, or Redbird, who was born on the Yankton Indian Reservation and also went by the name Gertrude Simmons Bonin, her missionary given name. And she was a very well-educated writer, translator, musician, and also a magazine publisher. And she wrote several chronicles of her cultural identity and the struggles that she had between the culture that was predominant, as well as her Dakota culture that she was born and raised in. And she was also the co-founder of the National Council of American Indians in 1926, and lobbied for Native people's rights to the United States to become citizens. And she served as the president until her death in 1938. She was an amazing figure during that time frame, leading the movement on the forefront. There were parades in Washington, D.C., in which, she led, besides some of the other groups that at that time were fighting for women's liberation and freedom. And she had, her own unique voice and spin on it, like many other of the other Indigenous women that were working in that movement as a Lakota woman. So with the women on the fight and the forefront, they had the ammo that they did need, with the inclusion of the Indigenous matriarchal societies and the preservation. So we talked about that earlier, from 1492 until the late 1800s, women are still not considered citizens of the United States. And we're still working on colonization of many indigenous communities, including the Nez Perce. And one of the people that came amongst the Nez Perce in that movement was a woman by the name of Alice Fletcher. She was an ethnographer studying Native American cultures. Alice was also a suffragist and addressed the 1888 International Council of Women. And in their first meeting of women's rights, advocating for the Western world, made the statement, "As I have tried to explain our statutes to Indian women, I have met with but one response. They have said, as an Indian woman, I was free. I owned my own home, my person, the work of my own hands, and my children could never forget me. I was better as an Indian woman than under white law." Alice Fletcher lived and worked amongst the Nez Perce people for quite some time, and it was really, I think, really important for me to note the contradiction that I found with my reverence for someone like Alice Fletcher in the work that she'd done as a suffragist. Yet in my pursuit of, academia, I've also learned in, her other role, and I found, my own, I guess you can say, conflict or schism as an Indigenous woman. I'm not baptized. I've never been necessarily adopted into any specific religion. I do my work to know and preserve the Nez Perce songs, but I saw, again, that's where I'm really excited to see the academia and pursuits that will come, from this time forward, because Alice Fletcher, prior to the last 3 years of my academic research, was kind of like the devil woman. I didn't really care to learn anything about her. I just knew only of her as an ethnographer that had more of a negative impact or influence on Nez Perce culture and time frame, because of her admonition for the Nez Perce way of life and her role that she was playing during that time frame. And then I guess I didn't take the time to get to know the more robust work that she was doing during that time, and to see how it was necessarily even connected together. The division of power between the sexes in the Indian Republic was nearly equal. Indigenous women of our native nations had rights, sovereignty, and integrity that was well documented and noted in the earlier European arrivals from the Louisiana Purchase and post Lewis and Clark expedition. Again, more robust denotations of the balance that exists between the sexes of the Indigenous societies and communities. One other thing that's super important to note is that we did have during that time frame, and continue to and have continued to maintain, is the economic interdependence, marriage based upon gender roles, and living in a culture free from gender-based violence. That was one thing that was that has been a really drastic shift, culturally speaking. I remember hearing from an Indian elder that had said that it was that our societies were ran based on that. It's not that the Indian man will ask how high to jump, and not if or when he should jump, but just how high. And I thought that that was really really interesting to see in the relationships of many of the elders that I know now. It's still a very tongue-in-cheek nuance that does exist, but I'm going to leave this contact up information here for just a quick second so you can write it down and think of any questions that you might have. And I do have a quick video that I'm going to share before I open it up to any questions and answers. But I do have some resources also. So I want to be able to send this PowerPoint presentation over to everybody. So I'll get it over to Dulcie so she can get you guys all of the PowerPoint presentation.
Indigenous women, especially empowering stories about Indigenous women. Our women are first out of history. When students are reading history, it's mostly from the colonizers' point of view. The Indigenous people are usually left out, or a lot of times they're written about kind of negatively. So that's just the way things are. Need to change that. My name is Gajijuni Fox. My name means I make flowers. I'm from Akwesasne Mohawk territory, for the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in Alberta clan. And the film is about the hidden history of how Haudenosaunee women influenced the women's rights movement, maybe 3 years ago, and timed it so that it would come out this year in 2020, because this year is the 100th year anniversary of the women's right to vote. And I wanted to tell the story of how our women influenced those early suffragists, like where they got their ideas to fight for their rights.
History is not what happened, it's who tells the story. You had to see something that told them that it was possible.
For us, the Haudenosaunee people, we're a matrilineal society. Our identity comes through the women's side, so that's something that's innate in me, because that's the way our culture is. That's an honor that we have as women to be able to live in the world, and that's something that's acknowledged, by the men. One of the things that I wanted to get across in the film is the difference in worldviews. So for us, in our creation story, the woman that first came here, Sky Woman, and created Earth, and they later had a daughter, and her daughter had twin boys, and they created everything else in balance. But that makes a big difference in like the stories that you're told, and the roles that women play in your culture makes a big difference in how you view yourself and how you carry yourself. Before European contact, domestic violence was pretty much unheard of in our villages, and things like that were just astounding for European women. Grandma would say, we're not going to laugh. With this year being the 100th anniversary, it's really time that this story known. I'd like to see this in every school, both in secondary and in higher education. I'm hoping that it really gets out there. This could change the way people think about the women's rights movement. So I think that's why it's so important for us to, as filmmakers, as teachers, as educators, as artists, that we start to share some of this history of the indigenous people on the land.
The makers. That was how it was also described to me, which I thought was absolutely fantastic and phenomenal, is that we are the givers of life. We are the makers. That's a very that's a very powerful notion to carry with us, and to note that that was our power. That was why the circle of life existed the way that it did, because the men knew that their seed could not grow without the woman. And so it is quite an honor to continue the threading of that knowledge and that journey. I think that we're all doing our part here this evening to carry that forward by seeking more knowledge, to carry that forward, to share it with our daughters, to come together as a woman community with those shared values. And so I wanted to thank everybody for joining us here this evening. And I'll get the program over to Dulcie so that she would be able to share it as a with the link of the resources, and open it up for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary Jane. I just did a quick look of that documentary preview that you shared with us, Without a Whisper, and it looks like it's available through PBS. So if folks want to watch it on their own, it looks really fabulous. Thank you for bringing it to my attention, at least. There's so much good programming on PBS, it's hard to keep track of all of it. So thank you. So I am happy to moderate questions through the chat function. You can also use the raise your hand function if you'd like to ask Mary Jane directly. I'll start. So Mary Jane, could you tell us a little bit more about what you knew about Alice Fletcher originally? I mean, it really struck me what you said about having conflicted feelings about her, because I kind of feel that way about a number of the suffragettes. Once you get to know a little more about them, it turns out they were like real human beings with complex lives, and just like everybody, right? They did some good things and they did some not so good things. And so that's one thing I know personally I've been trying to reconcile through this year of commemoration of the 19th Amendment's ratification, is that the suffragettes did a lot of good, but they weren't perfect individuals either. And there were people who were left out of that movement. So I'd be really interested to just know more about that perspective from you.
So when I first started my undergrad, I learned a bit more about the role that she had in more in the conflict and schism of Nez Perce religion in trying to get more conversions of Nez Perce people into Christianity, and just kind of her role as a saleswoman or pitchwoman of sorts for some of the new religions. And so I had, that one part of me is the Nez Perce woman who, knowing what that history led to with the conflict of our people and eventually the War of 1877, with studying, divide and conquer tactics. And then I was just intrigued by her in general, just that time period and time frame of knowing that women like her and Sue and Kate Macbeth were out doing this type of work. They were brave, they were bold, they were doing things that other women were not out there doing. And so that part of me was like, who were these women? What kind of backgrounds did they have or come from that made them want to go against the grain of the traditional American culture and society and expectations that were of them, even during that time period, to be pioneers in ethnography as women. And so then I was like, again, like big fans and, like little, girl crushes on the work that they did, because the preservation of their very unique perspectives as white women capturing Indigenous women culture during that time frame was critical, because the white male ethnographers were not doing that same level of work. And I just know from my work that I've done with women in preservation that, especially when it's done in a collaborative approach, that we can just see things just a little bit more forward thinking. And that's one thing that I did note with the work that they have done is it's ongoing. It is gifts that still continue to keep on giving.
Thank you. It looks like we do have one hand raised. Somebody with all I can see is JYDY. But if that individual would like to unmute themselves and ask a question, go for it.
Thank you. I'm actually Judy. I typed it wrong and I couldn't go back to fix it. My name is Judy Peasley. I live in Montana, and I'm actually from Colorado, but I've been in Montana 26 years. I'm considered a Chicana who left the Southwest and came up here, and because of the lack of Chicanas up here, I identified mainly with Native women. And I come from a mixed family. My mother is primarily Native American. She's passed last year, and my father is primarily Spanish. So I grew up with two sides of a family that were very different. My mother's side was very matriarchal, and my father's side was very patriarchal. And I grew up in a violent household because of the clash of the two cultures. My mother, and many, attempted daily to assert her independence and what she understood as her right to govern her home. And my father basically beat her and, treated her very badly. Yet they survived, 50 some years of marriage, 62 years of marriage actually. And, but it was due primarily to the clash of the two cultures and their expectations of each other. They resolved it somewhat, but never fully. When I moved up here, the first book I read was by Andres Garcia, who was a Spanish speaker in the 1800s who traveled from Juarez, Mexico, to trade among the French and the indigenous people of this area. He kept a journal for something close to 30 years. And a publisher tracked him down in California, in San Francisco, obtained the manuscript, adapted it, and published it in a book called A Rough Trip Through Paradise. In the first book I read, which I lent out and never got back, there were pictures of his indigenous wives. He had 3 in succession. Eventually married a white woman and settled in San Francisco. But he documented, and I don't remember particulars because I read that book many years ago, about 20 years ago. And it's still in print. It's still available, I think, in some libraries. But he did document the lifestyles that that demonstrated or described and exhibited the matriarchal lineage, and as well as the independence of the woman's role and power in the indigenous families. And he did that among the Blackfeet, the Shoshone, the Grovant, the Cinnabon, and I'm not sure, but I do believe he also had some experience with the Nez Perce.
Judy, thank you for sharing that. If you didn't quite catch that, A Rough Trip Through Paradise by Andres Garcia, I'm definitely going to look that one up.
And it was edited by a. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say is that what you were bringing has been really intriguing to me as well. I come from a home that has healed greatly from domestic violence. A big part of the domestic violence was substance abuse affiliated with my father's alcoholism. But also, it was something that my grandfather had said that when he returned home from the war, he did the same thing. He just got into this cycle of drinking, and he also grew up there. He said that was the hard thing for him, is he grew up in a home where he'd never seen his mother be struck, but something he said that when he was drinking. And I was really, really blessed to be able to have a relationship with my grandfather while I was learning the Nez Perce language, where he would talk about some very intimate things about his World War II experiences, about healing from being a domestic violence abuser as well as an alcoholic. But I'd never really thought or connected it much to the cultural clash of the women and men roles that we had with that increased violence, because I do know that we as Indigenous communities do suffer from a disproportionate and disparate rate of domestic violence in our communities, and it would be really interesting to to learn more about that correlation with our societies. One thing that was also really important to know in our Nez Perce cultures and societies that I think that we could we could all find some intrigue with, was that we came from a pluralistic marriage culture and society, and so it was still, even then, very common for a Nez Perce woman to leave her Nez Perce husband if he was not providing for her and her children. And it was woe to the husband. It was usually it was shame upon a man if a woman left him, and there was no repercussions to the Nez Perce woman when she made that choice. Well, I don't know if me now, I don't think I can handle that though.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that resource with us, Judy. I know Norma has a question. I'll invite Norma to unmute and share her question with Mary Jane.
Hi, MJ. Norma Staff down in Harpster. So in terms of the women's right to vote, when were Nez Perce women able to vote?
So the Nez Perce Constitution and bylaws, when we first became organized as a tribal government, the women's right to vote in our Nez Perce government in 1954 was the start of Nez Perce women formally voting in Nez Perce governance. However, I think many of our Nez Perce women, after the mainstream right for women to vote started voting in regular elections. I actually just had a visit with my grandmother the other day, and I asked her, when was your first time? My grandmother's 84 years old, and she's still out there working, very, very healthy, active, beautiful woman. And I asked her when it was her first time ever voting. Yeah. And she said that she didn't vote until the in 2008 during the election of President Barack Obama. It was her first time ever voting. And prior to that, the only elections that she had ever participated in were tribal elections. And so I had another Nez Perce elder, because I was like, oh, that's, I thought that was really interesting for my grandma. I've asked 3 other Nez Perce elders that are over the age of 65, and those other 3 elders have never participated in U.S. elections, but they participate regularly in tribal elections. I found that very interesting.
That is really interesting. I mean, did they share any other insights? Do they feel disconnected from the process? Are they dubious about the process? I think a lot of people are dubious about the process at this point, but
I think
they could have voted perhaps sooner.
Pardon, what was that?
Yeah, I mean, they likely could have voted sooner, but chose not to. And you were going to explain why, maybe, or what you know about that.
Well, it makes me a little bit more interested to know, the rate earlier on in some of our county elections. I know that the same is or historically had been true up until this year. And that's what's also really a high note to leave on, is that the voter turnout for Native peoples to the poll, despite in some communities where there were obstacles, and there have been not just obstacles, but outright actions to prevent Native people from voting in certain communities, is that we experienced a very high rate of Native voter turnout in this past election. That was really awesome to hear, because it has always been challenging in many tribal communities to get out the Native vote.
I mean, we'll have to have you back, Mary Jane, once you have a chance to ask more people. I'm ready for your research.
I know.
Okay, it looks like we've got one more comment here from Shannon, and I invite Shannon to unmute themselves, and that'll probably be our last question or comment before I thank you all for coming. So go ahead, Shannon.
Oh, okay, can you hear me? I'm sorry, my camera's not working right now. I just want to say thank you so much, Mary Jane, for sharing what you've shared. This is just so powerful, and there's a lot of resources that I didn't know about until tonight, and the quotes from Alice Fletcher, your own personal experiences, and interviews. And I just wanted to mention that and sort of amplify your message about, like, there's so much of this that is not written down, and that this is so important to document, and the work that you're doing is so important, because I'm an anthropologist, and I know that a lot of the stuff that's out there is there's an androcentric bias for sure. That's a continued bias even today, and I just wanted to I hope that we can continue to see more of your work, because I think it's brilliant. Thank you. So there's no question. Thank you.
I appreciate that. When I first started my studies at the University of Idaho for cultural anthropology, I had an amazing time working with Dr. Rodney Fry and Dr. Sappington. And that was one of the things that they highly encourage us, is we hardly see any Nez Perce women come through these studies. And so I did get sidetracked, so to speak, in the formal studies, but cultural anthropology, and specifically ethnography, has always been so, I mean, it's what drives me. And that's a big part of why I wanted to found THC magazine, because we're in such a pivotal time, and yet the recognition of Indigenous women's economies, especially our rope economies and our agricultural economies, could get lost to the wayside if somebody doesn't step up to do the work. So I'm ready to do it.
That's great. I totally agree. Thank you.
Well, I just want to say one more thank you to you, Mary Jane, for sharing your time and your insights with us this evening. It really is such a wonderful opportunity. You know, the beauty of Zoom, I guess. I wish we were all in person together, but Zoom allows a lot of us from different corners to come together. And I'm so grateful that you were willing to be part of our program this evening. I will remind folks that For All the World to See, Visual Culture and the Civil Rights Struggle is available to view at the University of Idaho Library. It is about the traditional civil rights movement, as you might think about it, from the 1940s to the 1970s. But of course, really civil rights has been a much longer struggle, as Mary Jane has obviously and very nicely articulated for us this evening. This program has been recorded, so I will add it to the Latah County Historical Society's YouTube page in the next day or two. So if you've got colleagues or friends that you think would enjoy viewing it, or you want to return to it to be reminded of the resources that Mary Jane shared with us, it will be available for viewing. But one more time, thank you so much, Mary Jane. Really appreciate it. Can't wait to hear from you again. We'll want to connect with you for sure.
Thank you, Dulcie,
Thank you,
too.
everybody. I appreciate it. Yes, thank you.
Have a great evening, everybody. Enjoy your holiday season.